morning, everybody. Welcome to this ENSMOV webinar. I am Livio De Chicchis from the Italian Federation for Energy Efficiency, and I'll introduce and moderate this event. We have organized this workshop to present and summarize the results obtained in the last year of events organized by the partners, especially for those of you who have not been able to actively follow our activities within the project. And the other aim to introduce the new cycle of events that will organize in the next month. Just some technical information. This webinar will be recorded and broadcasted in the next days to give the possibility to reach a broader number of participants. So for those of you who are on air, there is the possibility, of course, and I kindly invite you to pose any kind of questions, comments that you think it's worth, and we'll give an answer during the webinar or at the end of the webinar. Otherwise, there is the possibility to reach us at the email contacts that we'll share at the end of this presentation, and to speak with us also after this event. Let me just remind that the ENSMOV project has been designed to support stakeholders involved in the design, monitoring, and implementation of policies related to Article 7 of Energy Efficiency Directive. And apart from the reports about, for example, the status of policies, the gaps, the result, and the guides that will be that are and will be implemented to assist the stakeholders, and some of these guides will also be mentioned in the next speeches. The main idea of the project is to favor dialogue and encounters with our stakeholders, with European stakeholders. To do so, this means to collect feedback, understand their needs, provide examples, and most of all, stimulate the knowledge exchange. We have also put in place a platform, the KTP, the Knowledge Exchange Platform, with this aim to create a networking within European stakeholders. You can reach this platform going into the ENSMOV website. Coming to today's agenda, after my brief introduction, I will give the floor to Vlasis Oikonomou, ICP, which is the coordinator of the project, that will introduce you the new cycle of events organized. That will resume the outcomes of the second year of the second cycle of events. Then Gregor Tinius of the Austrian Energy Agency will make a focus on the MRV guide that has been produced in the last months within the project. And I'll finally give a short overview of what we have to expect from the next cycle of the events of the next month. So I don't want to lose more time with my introduction, so I'll give the floor to Vlasis for the outcomes of the second cycle. Please, Vlasis, the floor is yours.
Okay, so, all right. Thank you very much for that. You can see my screen. Okay, I will briefly present what we've done on the second cycle, and thank you for the introduction on the ENSMOV project. You know, you've been following it, and several countries have been following it, and they request assistance, and we're glad to provide it for implementing the Article 7 EED, both in terms of policy implementation, but also in terms of monitoring and verification requirements for that. So first of all, you see that the objective, as it was clearly mentioned, you know, there are the three items which you know now well, as we're in the third year, on sharing knowledge between the member states, providing tools and resources and assisting you in the form of a technical guide for each country or groups of countries when you have specific issues on the monitoring and verification aspects, as well as data requirements, means of setting up MRV schemes, and so forth. There have been different types and activities carried out, from needs assessment. You have all been invited to several needs assessments where we try to identify where the gaps you have and where you would need extra support. So the idea is that the whole project is bottom-up driven. We had some ideas in the beginning from our own experience on what were the real problems of the Article 7 implementation, but through your continuous support and feedback provided to us, we always discover new points, and that's where we offer extra guidance and extra workshops, or in various formats. And then, of course, we monitor what has happened during all these exchanges, and if some improvements have happened, and we are glad to see already documented improvement. These are so the 4 segments that I mentioned just now. Now, in the second round, and now we're entering, of course, the 3rd round, which you will see in a bit. But in the second round, the topics we dealt with, and the ones that were highly ranked by you and where you needed the most support, were primarily what type of IT tools, information technology tools, we have for monitoring and verification in countries, and several member states asked for specific support on that, on how to set up their own tool. Then the standard issues of the Article 7, additionality and materiality, which we try to capture based on some good practices. Side effects of energy efficiency obligations and alternative measures to be done. Then the energy efficiency fund, how we can set up funds, like for example in this example of Spain or other countries. Banking and borrowing of savings, be it in the form of certificates or just savings. And then the linking of the Article 7 and climate targets, and this of course becoming more and more relevant with the Fit for 55 package and the reality we live in now. And when finally FESCOs have delivered on the Article 7, where it's kind of complementary to the work being done by the JRC. So for the first part, I will just briefly go through the topics I mentioned, through the most important ones. In terms of the IT tools, we see that there is the most important role to ensure both the collection, monitoring, reporting, and evaluation of projects, and on the level of the project, but also then aggregating the projects to the policies outcomes. And this is even more important when we have lots of parties. So when we have types of policies that affect a large number of beneficiaries or target groups, which need to report back what they have done to implement the policy, so what type of energy efficiency activity they have undertaken. And of course, when there is lack of expertise, then the IT is very important. Then we saw that when the countries that have implemented IT, smart IT solutions and platforms for monitoring, their schemes have been quite successful, and there is quite robust and accurate results, when especially the IT is also linked to some field trials and some sampling for checks, be it on a building or industry level. Then of course the outcomes are quite more robust and quite more credible. For examples where the Austrian Energy Agency owns its e-government online application as part of the Energy Efficiency Act. And then in Croatia, it's the system for monitoring and verification of energy savings, the ENSMOV, which is also part developed from a previous project, the multi. It's already quite many years running, and I think it's a nice example for several countries that want to set up their own scheme. In Ireland, there is EMCS, the Energy Credit Management System. And in Italy, there is a platform for the white certificates projects, which is updating being updated due to the regulatory framework. So in these parts, you can log in, of course, to our platform, to our Article 7 EED.eu platform, and you can see all the materials from being explained per country. Then the second part was how to set up, develop, and modify MRV schemes. That's quite an interesting one, and you can see also the YouTube videos and the guidances. We discussed very much in detail the various MRV schemes that are in place in several countries, with the pros and the cons, and what the type of costs to implement its scheme, its MRV scheme, based on the experience of the member states. How long did it take, length, costs, and difficulty or easiness for the target groups to work on that. And there is also a report then on how to set up the MRV scheme. This is quite an interesting one, as it gives all the various options, and you can select which one should be the most appropriate to you. And of course, you can follow the YouTube. Then on the additionality and materiality, there was a link with the StreamSafe project, ENSMOV and StreamSafe, both sister projects. StreamSafe is also is mainly working on the calculation of energy savings aspects, but they both fall under the umbrella of the Article 7. And the idea from both of them was to examine the additionality as being one of the key principles, and of course the most challenging. Now there is different knowledge among member states next to the EC guidance on how to handle additionality in energy savings and calculations, and we provided several case studies, for instance, even more niche ones like the EVs in the federal car fleet in Belgium, or additionality at the policy level from the UK, and we have received quite interesting insights from various member states, of course, on that. Member states that declare additionality on a group of policies level, like the Netherlands, or on an individual level, like like several other countries. Also, in respect to different types of policy instruments, how the additionality is being measured, take taxation measures, or more complicated measures like energy efficiency obligations or subsidy measures and so forth. So this one has also, you can follow the link here in the Article 7 ED platform that I mentioned, and you can find all the materials related to the additionality. Then on the funds, I think that was also a quite interesting one, where the idea was to get some examples from how to build up and manage a fund from countries that have already a fund, like Spain, Croatia, Italy, and others, or are in the process of developing one. And the examples, of course, as I said, is from the 3 countries, and also Romania, which is in the process of building. And you can find an interesting video with all the insights. You know, the interesting part of the fund is that it is one part of the directive, of course, of the EED, of how to set up an energy efficiency fund. And I think it gains more and more interest, especially with the energy price crisis now, because a fund can be the central body that can respond quickly and in a short notice to energy efficiency programs for the short-term actions from the 1 to 5 months that are being required. Also, they were also mentioned in the toolbox circulated by the European Commission some days ago in response to the price crisis. Then the Article 7 and the new ED, I think that comes with the highest political debate, because you know that we have the Fit for 55, the emissions reduction goal in 2030, and with inter alia happening in 2024. And then the items being discussed was how all these things mix each other. So meaning that we have the introduction of the new obligation for the 1.5% of the final energy consumption. This replaces 0.8. Then we have the requirements to achieve a proportion of the energy savings for the energy poverty people, for the groups under energy poverty, or people living in social housing. And this changes a lot the picture, because there is now a specific target for the energy poverty within the Article 7. Then there is also the clauses for not counting energy savings from the direct combustion of fossil fuel technologies for heating, for instance, or for the industrial parts. And there it's quite a controversial, of course, aspect, because a lot of debates happen on that. But nevertheless, we have to be clear that some things cannot be counted, and there is for sure interaction about carbon targets here and the energy efficiency targets. And also the carrying over outstanding energy savings when the targets are not met. That's also an important element. You can find, so this has a lot of interesting items here, and you can have a look at how these targets interact. Then on the auctioning schemes, this is another one, policy in parallel sometimes to the energy efficiency obligation schemes, or replacing somehow the EOs. Quite an interesting one on the auctions, and they have been used in some countries in the last year. Sometimes they're used separate, on a completely separate level, or embedded in other financing schemes. And of course, the idea is to promote and to aggregate projects for energy efficiency, mainly in buildings and refurbishments. And several countries, as I said, are very much interesting and have passed laws on the energy efficiency auctions, but so far they are not being implemented, so support is required on how to do it. So there's quite diverse. As you see, it was Switzerland, Denmark, and Greece, 3 countries with 3 different auctioning schemes. And you can get concrete advice there on how to design and implement the auctions, and of course the pros and the cons, because there is no blueprint, the blueprint on one policy or not. The next one was the final sustainability and the cost effectiveness on the policies in the context of the Article 7. We know that the cost effectiveness is a very important element, of course, and it's not being easily calculated, because sometimes the way the schemes are being designed is like comparing apples to pears when you try to compare the costs. But nevertheless, what we try to see is the real costs. So the program costs in terms of how much subsidy or public money is being spent for the energy efficiency obligation scheme. Then and also alternative measures, then the societal costs, including the investment costs, and the administrative costs from the cost of the government. So setting up the schemes, running them, how many months are being required from staff in the public administration, and so forth. And it's interesting to see some aspects of the cost, of the real costs, and what such policies finally entail for the public sector and for the society, so that you can get inspiration of what works or not. Then in terms of long-term results, we do have a lot of interesting insights, as I said, from per country, that you can contact us in the Article 7 EED.eu platform. You can see that we have relevant staff members for each country, which are being monitoring closely what is happening in the countries and can provide more info. So feel free to browse on the map, and you can see what exactly impacts are happening and where we also contribute to that. This is all the process of the project. So developing the briefs, it's a lot of policy materials coming up, recommendations, and synthesis of outcomes. So a bunch of reports, but also quite customized recommendations for that. And these are our partners, and you can always come in contact. And here is a link to the platform that I mentioned. It's a relatively simple to understand, Article 7 EED.eu, and you can find all the information there. Thank you very much, and we can move on to the next.
Thank you, Vlasis. Thank you for this overview. A lot of interesting and actual, first of all, topics to exploit. Among the outcomes of this second cycle, a focus is dedicated to the MRV, to the monitoring, reporting, and verification. So in the next intervention, we would like to give an overview of the contents to be considered when setting up an MRV scheme, an MRV system for Article 7 of Energy Efficiency Directive. So I give the floor to Gregor Tinius of Austrian Energy Agency, who are the authors of this MRV guide, and he'll show some of the contents and an overview of the contents of this guideline. So please, Gregor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Livio. Good morning to all of you. Well, as announced, I would like to give you a short taste of this MRV guide. I think it's a summary, but I also have to tell you that also the report itself is not a very long one, so we try to make it really as usable as possible, and just concentrate on the things that really, you know, are maybe that you could think about, you can harmonize or standardize. Basically, it's a document that is about, let's say, tips of what you should think about when building up and setting up such an MRV system. And I think, and also maybe something that I have to mention is that some of the contents of this also come from our experience as Austrian Energy Agency, being the monitoring authority in charge for the last for the years 2014 to 2020. So we were right in the middle of this process, let's say. Well, just a short background of the report. MRV, in our interpretation or in our opinion, in the course of the implementation of Article 7 means that you track the additional implemented individual energy savings actions, to reduce final energy consumption. So that's the main purpose, and I think that's also the minimum that you should achieve with your MRV system. But later slides, I will tell you that maybe sometimes you should think about a little bit more in MRV. So what we did, we prepared a guidance that is designed in a kind of step-by-step approach. So what you should start with and what then you should do in the end. And then, well, basically it's a cycle. So you start then again in the end. It is available on the Article 7 platform that is closely linked to ENSMOV, and maybe also sometimes the report, I think, assumes that you also read another report of ENSMOV, which is called Parameters for MRV, where many of the technicalities are explained, let's say, or important aspects of monitoring and verification are mentioned. And I will just jump into the 5 steps. So we organized this this report in 5 distinct steps, but maybe I will say this for every step, that you shouldn't underestimate, or you cannot overestimate the importance of each of these steps. But the first one is really a very decisive one. So defining the purpose of monitoring is key, and this is on one hand the aim of the monitoring itself and how the data will be used. As I said in the beginning, you have a minimum requirement. You need to track Article 7 final energy savings in the standard case, at least, and most member states chose this standard approach of just reporting and using final energy savings. But you might think that maybe you want to do something more. And here, really, this is the first instance where really our experience as monitoring agency comes in. Because you might think about additional purposes of the monitoring. You have to realize that when you collect data on implemented energy efficiency actions, you get a lot of information, a lot of data, especially if you have an energy efficiency obligation scheme. But if you do not think before implementing the MRV what you really want to get out of it, afterwards you will not get it. So in Austria, for example, and in many other countries, of course, the second purpose of the monitoring was the individual target fulfillment of single suppliers. So one important first step was, of course, to make this possible, that entities, organizations can report the data, because only then we can also monitor the individual target fulfillment. But you could also want to afterwards analyze the energy savings reported more deeply. And if you want to do so you really need to collect the data, and you need to think about what data to collect. Statistical purposes. But here again, you can only basically use the data you collect in MRV if you make this data available for statistical analysis. So just as an example, collecting PDFs will probably not do it, because you cannot use these documents. You have information, but you cannot get out the information of tens of thousands of individual PDF files. An important issue, and this somehow also dates back to a previous project that we coordinated at the Austrian Energy Agency called EPAD, is also that you might want to use the data that you collect in monitoring for policy evaluation. So for determining the impacts of the policy, and then also being able to improve the policy, to make it work better. And that's actually the target here I mentioned. So I mean, this is not a taxative list, of course, but the main message is really define the purpose of monitoring and think well before what you need. I think or we think that only after that you can go to step 2 and create a sound legal basis. I know that in many cases it very often is the other way around. So you create a legal basis first, and then you think about what you can put in this already quite limited framework. Basically, and we see this in a lot of countries, the broad framework of MRV is defined in a law. So who is the authority, who is monitoring, what are they allowed to do, what is their status, their legal status, these general things, but the implementation details, like for example, how to calculate energy savings, are very often defined in subordinate legal documents like regulations or decrees. And this has a very good reasoning behind it because they are easier to adapt. It's very difficult to change a law, but it's at least a little bit easier to adapt a decree. So the issues to be defined, and we think they should all be defined in law actually, are of course the target group stakeholders. So who are, in the case of the EOS, who are the obligated parties, and define them very clearly. Define what rights and duties each of these stakeholders has, and who is doing what, who is reporting, who is monitoring, who is analyzing, and also who is ensuring compliance. So who is more or less issuing penalties or fining companies that do not comply. The scope of monitoring, that's also very important, especially in our time, I think, of data protection and all these issues concerned with data protection. So if you do not, basically the experience is, if you do not define by law all the exact data that has to be reported, of course companies will refuse to report them afterwards. So just because you want this data, this will not do. The reporting processes, this includes the national and the international level, the timeline for monitoring activities. Also, this should actually derive from the legal basis already. The enforcement of compliance, as I said, and also the legal character of the communication between the monitoring authority. It's not always an authority, like in Austria, it was not an authority, which was quite a problem in the end, or quite an issue in the end, let's say, and the parties reporting savings. And I would just like to give you an example of the reasoning why we put the timeline here for the monitoring activities. So we think basically what you should start with is the end. So what you need in the end, there is a certain date where you need your either final NECP, or as it used to be, the final energy efficiency action plan. And from that date, you should kind of backcast what time you need. You need to, well, the company, the obligated party, has first has to plan and assess the feasibility of action. It has to implement an action. There's an implementation date. After that, they try to derive the effects of these actions. There is a reporting deadline to the monitoring authority, but then the whole monitoring process starts. So basic message here is that you should also leave enough time for companies to implement, report, and calculate the savings for the measures. Of course, keeping in mind that you will need the data at some point for either reports to the European Commission or reports, like it was in Austria, also to the national parliament. The step 3 after the sound legal basis is also one that you cannot underestimate as all other 5 steps. It's setting up the infrastructure. And also this takes quite a lot of time, or let's put it another way, it must not take a lot of time, because in the case of Austria, it was actually quite quick, but it needs a lot of resources and efforts. What you need to do in the monitoring agency, monitoring authority, is build up human resources. And you need very different kinds of qualifications, So you need the kind of people that disseminate information material. They explain, they work together with the stakeholders, they do the networking. I would say this was kind of, it was close to what I did for the last 7 years. although I also dealt with other issues, but it was very much in this direction. But you also need the numbers people. So you need people who check the reported data, who verify the data, and you need people who do the analysis. You basically, in an EEOS, very often you have a big data situation, more or less. You have tens of thousands of measures, and just assuming that each measure has 10 to 20 data points in it that could be of interest, you have a really very, very high number of data points that you need to deal with. And I think you have to be well prepared for that, because it's really a lot. You have to set up a reporting infrastructure. Of course, I would say as simple as possible. The IT applications work very well, but especially they work well for a high number of obligated or involved parties. You might think if you have a very little number of involved parties, you don't need an IT application. However, what you have to keep in mind is it also has to be as safe as possible, because you are actually processing company data or consumer data. So the data protection issue can very well be dealt with an IT application. And of course, you need to, and this is the relation to the analysis of the reported data. You need to export the necessary data for all the reports, for all the verification you want. So you also need this kind of relation between the systems. And we also had, let's say, at least one resource, one full resource that only prepared broad general information material for stakeholders. You should, in our opinion, especially if you have a lot of obligated parties, have a website. We had a telephone hotline for the first year that was busy all the time. 2 to 3 people full time were just on the telephone and answering questions. And you organize events and workshops. So the information part is very important. I will also spend some time on the steps 4 and 5. The step 4 is the one that maybe not everybody is looking forward to, because it's actually, for most of the time, you do just this thing. You execute repetitive tasks. This is actually your target of the MRV, that you implement a system that is then very, very stable. You have many standardized processes, and you do this for quite a long time and only change little things if you see they don't work. What you keep on doing for the most of the time is keep on informing target groups and stakeholders, but the effort for this, of course, decreases a lot in the years after implementation. So after 2 or 3 years, this is quite a small amount of effort. But you do verification, you do a lot of verification, you do a lot of data analysis, processing data. You have to enforce compliance, you have to communicate with the stakeholders or with obligated parties on that, and that's not always easy, because you also argue a lot with them, of course. And you do kind of adaptation processes in itself. For example, you adapt calculation methodologies or rules of how to calculate energy savings. And finally, you also deliver data for policy evaluation. And you can do policy evaluation both on the process and or on the impacts. I would say in some countries, I have the feeling still the process evaluation is much more common than a real ex post, let's say, impact evaluation. And then the last point of the circle is improving the installed processes. And of course, then you more or less start from the beginning, because maybe you even need to change the legal basis at some points when you see something doesn't work. So what you also have to do is install, let's say, a system or a process that regularly checks and also collects the feedback, what works and what can be improved. But I also have to warn you, because EOS, for example, are based on a law. Usually only small changes are possible, of course, with an acceptable amount of effort, of political effort. So it's really important to think about these first steps in the cycle beforehand. And okay, there is a typo, but anyway, deliver data for the evaluations, of course, or let's say prepare for evaluation. It's also important. It's a little bit more than I put here in step 4, because here you can really, how to say, you can have an internal, within the monitoring authority and the ministry, you can have an internal evaluation process, a regular one, but you can also include the stakeholders. And that's also what was done in Austria, that at a certain point, there was a larger evaluation discussion process on what works and what doesn't work. Yes, and that's more or less it. So we defined these 5 steps. I showed you in the beginning where to find these reports, and I really hope you will find them useful. And well, thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. Precious tips. I just mentioned an example from Italy, where we often have some issues in the reporting of energy savings from regions to energy agency to ministry. So there is a need of standardization, and I think many of the tips included in this guideline can help, just to mention our example, but it's precious to have some indication. So I'll retake the presenter role to present, to say what we are going to expect in the 3rd cycle. Okay, now you should see my screen. We have already organized some events in the next month, in the next cycle, what we call the 3rd cycle of events. In this table, you can see a draft of the timeline, because we consider the timeline indicative just to give you an indication about the period. Then we'll give proper information and more exact information through our channels, website and newsletter. The next events will be focused basically on the taxation and on the energy poverty. We have taught 2 different events about these topics. Taxation is, of course, one of the main provision of the new Fit for 55 package. So we'll discuss about the designing and the implementation of energy and CO2 taxation measures from a policy point of view, from a policy framework. The other topic is about the energy poverty, and in particular the energy efficiency measures to alleviate the energy poverty. Then we'll focus on the link between the 2 main energy efficiency directives, so the Energy Performance Building Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive, in particular regarding the ban of fossil fuels and electrification. Electrification will be also another main provision of the following years, together with the ban, goes in parallel with the ban of fossil fuels, and we'll discuss in a dedicated event how this can be made, and the framework and the horizon of these topics. Then we'll dedicate a focus on the energy efficiency, on the energy service companies, the ESCOs, with a tailored workshop on their role, on their capabilities in making energy efficiency. And then we have thought it's worth to create a link between the ENSMOV project and other projects that deals with SMEs. We know that there are many barriers in energy efficiency among the SMEs, technical, informative, and also from a capability point of view barrier in the SMEs, and we are involved, we and all the consortium, also the partner of the consortium are involved in other projects that deals with overcoming the barriers to make energy efficiency in small and medium enterprises. For example, there is the ENSMOV project, Lab for SME project, and others. We'll discuss in a dedicated event how to create cooperations between our project that mainly deals with policy and Article 7 topics with these other projects that are also in a way more technical and go through the technical energy efficiency measures in small and medium enterprises. At the end, we'll also dedicate an event on the role of the rebound effects in monitoring and verifying energy savings. So this is an overview of the events that we have designed for the next cycle. Just to repeat, take this timeline as a draft. Then I kindly invite you to stay tuned on our channels to have the exact schedule of this event. So we have arrived to the conclusion of this dissemination webinar. If there are no questions, as I said, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on demand in the next days, and I share our contacts, in particular my email for any further questions that will come about this webinar context, and the link of our website and of our LinkedIn group that is active also to make a discussion and a networking between the stakeholders involved. So I thank you for your attention. I thanks also our speakers that have well presented the outcomes and the outcomes of the second cycle. And I invite you to stay tuned of our channels and follow us in our next and our following activities. Have a nice day, and bye-bye.